So last time we talked about groupthink, and the time before that we talked a little bit about the group stages and group development. Now we're going to get into sort of the nitty-gritty of how a group operates. So think back to a time when you were in a small group where you had a real positive outcome. So maybe it was a class project, maybe it was a family gathering, maybe as part of an athletic team. Think about what happened to create that positive outcome. So this functional theory of group decision making focuses on the communication that happens within the group and how important that is to make groups successful. Right? Again, group decision making depends on whether the group's communication fulfills certain necessary functions. There are 4 of them, so we'll talk about that in a little bit. Right? Talk is not just a byproduct of decision making, it is the decision making process. So studies have shown that groups that communicate really effectively have a greater chance of having a positive outcome at the end than groups that are dysfunctional in their communication strategies. Right? So Hirakawa and Gorin developed this theory in the mid-1980s. What was interesting about it is they actually studied group dynamics. They recorded groups as they talked and looked at the groups and sort of cataloged everything the group did and then coded that and then analyzed what was going on. So they looked at real world situations and sort of figured out what made a group effective. And they decided that there were 4 requisite functions that had to happen in a group in order to guarantee that it might have a good chance of success. All right, the first one is analyzing the problem. So you've got a couple of things you're going to have to do in this class. The first one is sort of analyzing some kind of TV show or movie about the small group dynamics in there. So make sure that you're focused on the actual problem. Then you want to set goals. Establish the criteria. Again, we have certain sort of outcomes that I'm expecting in this class, so you need to sort of establish those criteria and how you're going to meet those. Right? Then you need to identify alternatives. So again, we talked about groupthink in the past. You need to bring ideas to the group rather than have somebody in a leadership position to sort of push through his or her own idea. So you need to consider alternatives, and that's where that sort of devil's advocate or central negative needs to come in here and say, okay, there might be another way of sort of accomplishing and completing this task other than what we've talked about so far. Right? Then you need to evaluate those alternatives. Again, keep in mind, you've only got a couple weeks to do the first project. You only have a couple weeks to do the second project. You have other classes. You have other responsibilities. You may work. You may be on a team. You have other things going on in your life. So you've got to evaluate the alternatives and base it on what's actually happening in your lives as part of the team to sort of function effectively. Okay. So vigilant interaction. So they describe this as careful, thorough, and critically engaged with the 4 functions. Right? So you're not rushing through this, you're actually thinking about identifying the problem, considering alternatives, doing all those kind of things. Right? Communication then becomes the mechanism where you make good decision. Right? It affects the quality of the decision. Right? Talk is the cause, it's not just the symptom of this in this theory. Right? You can also sort of correct a group that has drifted off track. That's the counteractive function. Right? So sometimes you may get off track, and we'll talk about that in the next little brief video. But you want to get back on track to sort of get the task completed. So there needs to be a member of the group who sort of says, okay, that was interesting, but now let's get back on task, right? Right? And you want to promotive talk. In the world of sort of stand-up, they talk about yes and rather than no but. So if someone's sort of going off into a tangent and then you sort of jump in and go yes and you add to that. Right? So you're not sort of just being disruptive, you're being promotive, you're sort of encouraging the group to think through this and move forward. So here's a capstone topic thing. If you're having a group that has to choose what you're going to do for your final graduation project, right? You realize you've got an issue that may or may not be good. It may be too broad for what you're trying to tackle in the next 12 weeks that you have to finish it. So you got to sort of narrow it down. So you're looking at the analyzing the problem, sort of coming up with a solution, and you're setting goals. Hey, it's got to be done by this week. We all want to do a good job. We have all this much time left. So we've analyzed the problem and set goals, right? You've identified alternatives. So maybe you all submit a topic that you may think be worthy of a capstone project that you're going to do. And then you evaluate the alternatives. Maybe you have some kind of criteria or scorebook or some kind of rubric that you're going to use, but you come up with a way of analyzing the different alternatives and picking the one that you think is going to lead most to success. So part of the group, again, going back to that last quiz and the last part of the semester, think about a group decision you were part of, either a good or bad one, right? And then think about the 4 functions and whether your group addressed it well. So did they analyze the problem, consider the alternatives, all those kind of things. Identify which misfunction, if any, hurt the outcome most. And oftentimes it's sort of just ramming things through. You want to get to the end fast. You really don't spend time thinking about the issue, right? And then in groups, when you do the podcast at the end of the semester, you're going to sort of talk about that. So again, maybe one of a member of your group is going to sort of tackle the whole idea of this theory and how it might have affected some of your decision making in the project that you're going to complete this semester. So it's very flexible. It directly links communication behavior to decision quality, which makes it very practical and pragmatic. It's also built from analysis of real group discourse. There are some drawbacks to the theory as well, all right? Again, sort of that idea that you have to have all four of the functions, and you got to go through them in linear fashion, makes it a little too rigid, a little too mechanical. So you got to be a little more free-forming, free-thinking about this. You can't just sort of blast through and sort of, okay, if we do all these four things correctly, we're going to have a great outcome. It doesn't always guarantee a great outcome. It just increases the chances of having a good outcome. So again, effective decision-making requires the four functions: analyzing the problem, setting goals, identifying alternatives, and evaluating those alternatives. All right. Again, it doesn't matter the order, just as long as you can sort of go back and forth between them. Right? Communication is the mechanism that produces decision quality. It is not just a product of it, byproduct of it. Right? And then use those checklists and think about how your group did that. Good luck with this, and see you next time.